Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and it's time for another worst to best ranking. A little bit of a different one this time. So, weren't expecting this, were ya? I'm aware that this is pretty off-brand for a channel that otherwise limits itself to talking about electronic music. Yes, are not electronic, they're prog-rock. They're classic rock. They're stuff some of my usual audience's dads might listen to. And they're also a pretty big part of my own life, too. I myself am actually a pretty big prog rock fan. I have a short list of like 6 non-electronic outfits that I'd be willing to do a full-on off-brand worst to best ranking video like this one. And they're mostly prog bands like Yes. I could do a video like this for the Moody Blues, Pink Floyd, Steven Wilson and Porcupine Tree. Could do one for the Alan Parsons Project. Could do a whole full-on series for those guys. Now, it's not like this is ever going to be a regular thing on my channel. I doubt I'll do more than one like this a year, because that short list I mentioned is, in fact, quite a short list, where I'd run out of bands I'd be willing to talk about pretty quickly. I feel like for me to go off format like this, the band would need enough of a personal connection with me, and I would also feel like I'd actually be adding something to the conversation. Like, King Crimson isn't on my short list since I haven't been a fan of theirs long enough, and still have yet to hear their other stuff outside of the first album. I'll get to it. And the Beatles and Led Zeppelin have enough of a personal connection, but I wouldn't have much fun putting together videos about them. Neither of those are prog bands, but you get what I mean. Yes felt like it was a perfect one to do, though, because I have sat through all of their studio albums before. I do have pretty solidly formed opinions on them, and easily enough of a personal connection to their music, having been a fan since I was in high school. Now, I get a funny feeling that this video is going to attract some attention from people who don't usually watch my videos and who are significantly older than me, so let me make it clear to those people. I'm 23. I was obviously not born yet to see the band in their prime or experience the vast majority of their albums as they were happening. Only album I saw release as it happened was Fly From Here. So needless to say, I'm going to have a pretty different perspective from the older veteran fans. And this ranking, as always, is completely subjective. It's just ranked on my personal enjoyment, and that's it. Be warned, I did not make this video to hold up the popular consensus on this band. Not that there's much of a consensus on Yes's catalog to begin with, but there'll be some rankings here that I imagine a lot of people will disagree with. Well, there will be a lot of rankings that go against the typical grain, and I anticipate many people in the core fan base may get very angry. Just keep in mind that it's all just my opinion, and it's nothing to take too seriously. And if you are someone who watches my usual videos and isn't familiar with Yes, but is interested in giving them a shot, maybe this video will convince you to look into them. I certainly will not be recommending all 21 albums highlighted in this video, but maybe I'll be able to help you navigate their massive back catalog. So, oh yeah, and I'm only counting studio albums. Like, I will not be including the unofficial Anderson Bruford Wakeman Howe album, but I will be counting the 2 Keys to Ascension albums. So, yeah, and enough prelude, may as well get into it. Yes! Worst to best. So let me begin by letting you know how rocky these hot takes are going to get just with my first bottom pick, because at number 21, I have Close to the Edge. Just kidding, it's Open Your Eyes. And I think this is most people's pick for the worst Yes album. I kinda wanted to not pick this for the bottom spot since it felt like too easy of a target that's picked on enough already. And I actually kinda like the first track here, New State of Mind. It's a perfectly serviceable opener that does not exemplify why the album is so universally hated. I also don't mind Universal Garden with its faux orchestral touches. I don't think it's the worst production I've ever heard on a Yes album either. I mean, it's not the best, but Talk and Big Generator probably sound worse than this does on average. Well, there's some low points, like the title track sounds like total crap, but they've still done worse in that department. I think I mainly just don't like the way their harmonies sound off on that one. This is dead last, though, because in all the other moments I haven't mentioned, it's either really boring or flavorless, or stupid and corny. Sometimes both. Even the two highlights are not particularly memorable or even close to on par with their best material. New State of Mind is basically going for the one meets City of Love, and not nearly as good as either of those, and again, that's the good one. The other stuff is just... yikes. There's a crappy attempt at something reggae flavored with No Way We Can Lose. There's the excessively corny Fortune Seller, which was way too chipper for its own good, and they say 1-800 at the end as if it were an ad or something. There's Man in the Moon, which I wanted to like on the promise of the title, but they go for the most distractingly basic and childlike lyrical concepts that title could give you. Like, they really, unironically, repeatedly say, round and around I go, where I stop nobody knows. Are you fucking serious? Love Shine is also similarly dumb and basic. Can you feel the love shine? Can you feel the love shine? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all good people. Nice, unfinished Abbey Road reference there. But most of the other moments on here are just really bland, nothing songs. Wonder Love from the Balcony, Somehow Someday, The Solution. Could not give less of a crap about these. The latter has a theoretically cool 16-minute ambient field recording thing tacked on at the end, but even that gets ruined by the randomly inserting choruses recycled from previous songs on the album every few seconds. Can't even enjoy some field recording stuff in peace. Yeah, this album is bad. It's really bad. I don't even care that there's no big epic prog-rock type material that's their usual bread and butter. I don't usually mind the poppier side of Yes as much as most people seem to, but this album is just impossibly lame and disappointing, and not even really in an interesting, so bad it's good way, or in a way that really pisses me off and sticks with me. It just sucks. I didn't get the slightest hint of joy out of listening to it, and that's it. Moving on. And number 20, I have Union. Yeah, I hope you're not a huge fan of 90s Yes, since I don't have many nice things to say about this era of their career. And Union is probably an uglier album that pissed me off more. The first 2/3 or so of Union is flat out awful. One of their most boring and bland releases ever, and barely anything of interest happens at all. Maybe there's a forgettable solo guitar piece from Steve Howe and a bizarre and somewhat cringy reggae-influenced track, Saving My Heart, that mainly stuck out to me because it doesn't sound exactly the same as everything around it. But so much of this album is overproduced, bland garbage, with not a single notable hook, or instrumental texture, or interesting structure, or anything notable in any capacity. Full of tracks that aren't bangers or ballads, they're not anything, they're just blah. With so many sentiments about peace and unity that are delivered with such little passion that you don't believe them for a second. It's just so goddamn boring and flavorless and tedious to get through. This album's first 9 tracks almost single-handedly put it in dead last for me. I flat hated the majority of this. As for what saved Union from falling in dead last is that this album bizarrely has a bunch of good moments right at the end. The last 5 tracks go into actually decent territory with a couple of moments that I could even see myself returning to. One of those is Angkor Wat. That's a pretty beautiful ambient synth odyssey, really well layered, with solid production and a random kid talking in some other language that I don't recognize at the end. Not only interesting, but interesting in a good way. That track is solid. Then Dangerous is a pretty decent song with some rollicking energy I can get into. Holding On is, well, it ain't Hold On from 90125. I mean, if that one had been placed earlier in the album, it'd just be as bad as everything before, but being propped up by not having 7 other identical tracks around it leads to it being mildly tolerable. Even Song is a cool little instrumental interlude, and then Take the Water to the Mountain is a low-key but really nice and maybe subtly mysterious-sounding closer that I enjoyed a fair bit. I could hang on to that one, too. The last 5 tracks on this thing just barely raised this album up enough to a point where I could almost forgive the tediousness of the beginning. They at least leave you on a good note. But those songs are not substantial enough to excuse the absolute boatload of tedious and flavorless nothing rock that the rest of the album delivers. 2 good songs does not make this album worth checking out. Union is just, as a whole, not good. Even in interviews, some band members admit the title is kind of bullshit and no one remotely enjoyed themselves while they were recording it, and yeah, it freaking shows. I just skip it entirely. Whoopsh. At number 19, I have Talk.
Where will you be when you're not here?
Talk is not as excruciatingly tedious a listen as the first 2/3 of Union. This is one example of me feeling like if you do really like this album, I will at least get it. I don't hate this album or think it's terrible. The band doesn't sound like they hate each other on this one either. That said, there really isn't anything I particularly like about it either. The most constructive thing I have to say about it is that the mixing feels really off on this one in many parts. Like the drums and some of the guitars are way louder than the vocals and it feels weirdly off balance. But more than anything, the album's just boring. The production feels super dated. There's this one guitar tone which is just inherently late 80s, early 90s and was on every single production in rock music ever to come out around this time. It's all over this too, and you cannot escape it. The tracks themselves have a couple of decent moments, I guess. The Calling, Where Will You Be, parts of Endless Dream, but I'm not sure what about these tracks is more appealing than the stuff in their prime. Like, it's not the instrumental textures. This is really bland and plain stuff, nowhere near as satisfying or interesting as the 70s stuff. And it's not the hooks. The Calling is probably the catchiest, but even that completely disappears from my head after every listen. It has some of their complexity still there, like it ends in that big 15-minute 3-part epic with Endless Dream, but even this is like a heavily watered-down version of some of the epics of Yes's past, like Awaken and others. I don't know why you wouldn't go back to listen to those instead. This album, more than anything, feels pointless and adds nothing to the conversation. If this particular era of music and production style is your thing, I suppose it'll be fine, but for me it's background music at best. Inoffensive and pleasant enough, but nothing really of substance there at all for me to grab onto. Whoopsh. At number 18, I have the self-titled Yes.
I see you.
The debut! Yeah, here's the first big hot take. I've never cared for this one much at all. It's one of the least essential Yes albums in my eyes. I mean, it's basically the band in prototype form. You can recognize it as their style, but they had none of the tunes to back themselves up. The whole thing tends to blend together in an incoherent mush for me. Every track just wanders around aimlessly, and none of them leave a strong impression on me at all. Well, okay, the cover of The Birds I See You is pretty fun, and then there's also a cover of the Beatles' Every Little Thing, which I kinda can't believe even exists. But the rest is just whatever. Maybe kinda telling that the two most memorable songs on here are covers. The musicianship on display isn't even that impressive compared to what they would deliver afterwards. They fall off beat a few points, John Anderson sings off key sometimes, the performances are unrefined to the point of them basically sounding like a wannabe version of themselves. I can see this having the appeal of seeing them in so much rougher form. It's certainly not hard on the ears or anything. Comparing it to the 90s stuff I have ranked below this, the rougher appeal of this album is a flavor and not an uninteresting one. They're still clearly talented musicians, but still, why come here when you can go to something like Fragile that showcases their musicianship in a much more effective and refined way? To me personally, this debut sounds like total amateur hour in comparison to most of their other stuff, and still comes off rather dull and forgettable all the way through. It's sort of like their Pablo Honey equivalent, in that it shows a fraction of their promise that they would go on to show on later projects at best. You could take it as inspirational in a way, knowing that even rock legends like Yes were once complete nobodies. A project like this is entirely excusable because they had just gotten started and didn't know what they were doing yet. Everyone's got to start somewhere, but retrospectively I don't see the need to keep this around when they have so many other albums to their name that do similar stuff and consistently do it better. It may be excusable, but that doesn't change the fact that it's just not a fun listen in my eyes. Whoopsh. At number 17, I have Heaven and Earth.
What's wrong with the new revel?
I don't know which idea I dislike more. The idea of Yes releasing another album after this without Chris Squire or John Anderson, or this being the final Yes album. Okay, maybe that's a little harsh. This album isn't that bad. And I don't think I actually want Yes to make another album after this, but still, as a send-off to this band, this is really weak. and coming after two other possible send-offs that both would have been way better places to end the Yes story. I'm not gonna shit on the new singer, John Davison. He does a pretty solid John Anderson impression that could have fooled me. He's probably the most consistently enjoyable element of this album, and people have said, hey, at least this last album doesn't sound like any of the other Yes albums. That's also true, I suppose. This album feels pretty genuine and heartfelt across the board, and there's also more moments I liked here than I did on the self-titled. Like, there's actually 3 pretty solid tracks on here. I think To Ascend has a really nice and airy feel to it and has a surprising amount of emotion poured into it that worked really well. I think that was probably my favorite track on here. In a World of Our Own has a pretty decent, vaguely jazz-tinged groove, and it has vibraphones. I like vibraphones. And Subway Walls is a solid enough closer. The intro is a lot of cool synth orchestra stuff that reminds me of Jean-Michel Jarre a little. It has the most traditionally prog-rock structure with all its free-flowing change-ups and Hammond organ solos. And this track has by far Chris Squire's best bass performance on the album. All those songs are good. But the rest of this album is just tepid, airy soft rock that leaves no impression on me. It feels so toothless and lacking an instrumental muscle or groove. I guess it could be like a laid-back comfort food album. I can kinda see the appeal in that way, but I don't listen to Yes for laid-back comfort food music. I have like a gazillion down-tempo and ambient albums on my iPod for when I'm in that mood. This does not have enough flavor to work for me in that way. But what's really inexcusable about this album is the production. The whole thing sounds almost MIDI programmed. The guitars sound fake, the drums, oh god, the drums especially sound synthesized and sometimes almost non-existent. The whole thing is just depressingly weightless and cheap sounding. I mean, Yes don't always need to sound like badasses, they can have low-key moments too, and I can't get mad at it since I feel like they were at least trying. 3 good songs out of 8 isn't the worst track record a Yes album has ever had, but they still feel like a shell of what they used to be, and it's just kind of sad to listen to. At number 16, I have Tornado.
Your first time last, your first time asked to justify.
Ooh, Tornado. Pretty much agreed upon as the worst 70s Yes album. I personally don't think this album is offensively awful or anything. It's certainly listenable all the way through and has its share of good moments. I think the first 2 and last 2 tracks on this album are all pretty solid. Future Times Rejoice is a nice triumphant opener. Don't Kill the Whale has some pretty fun chord progressions. Onward is a decent enough ballad with some neat orchestral elements. And On the Silent Wings of Freedom is a solid way to go out, of course finishing with the longest and most complex piece. I'll even say Madrigal is fine too, with all its old-timey harpsichords. It's an interesting flavor. But there's also a bunch of corny, half-baked ideas like Arriving UFO and Circus of Heaven. The latter in particular is just kinda awkward. There's a little kid brought on in it who isn't even impressed by what's going on either. John Anderson apparently thought it was a good idea to bring on his son to complain about the lack of clowns. Arriving UFO at least has some cool instrumental passages, but the beginning when they're talking about UFOs feels kinda corny and on the nose. Release also feels kinda self-congratulatory with its out-of-nowhere applause sounds in the background, but offering nothing of substance to back up that reaction, it feels quite fake. But I think this album's biggest crime is that there's just nothing you can get out of Tornado that you couldn't already get out of a previous Yes album and better. There are good moments on here, but there's no great moments, and everyone just sounds checked out. Yes could previously deliver silly or ridiculous ideas with confidence and get you into it. Tales from Topographic Oceans has a pretty far-reaching concept that a lot of people thought was way too much, but John Anderson was so thoroughly convinced of its coolness and selling it with total sincerity. Here, though, everyone feels like they're just kind of going through the motions, trying to put something out for the sake of putting something out. It all feels very half-assed. Is the thing terrible? No. Most of it is at least about as good as the last leg of Union, if not better, but it is very forgettable and meh. Even the best moments here are nowhere even close to the best moments of other albums of theirs. And after they had such a consistent run they had throughout the entire 70s, for this middling non-effort to come in at the tail end of the decade, I don't think I can really excuse it. It's a very okay, if disappointing album that you could skip and not miss all that much. Whoosh. At number 15, I have Big Generator. You know, I don't think 80s Yes is nearly as bad as some people have made it out to be. I can't bring myself to really hate on this album when it has 2 songs on it that I have always really loved and still come back to every now and then. And it's the 2 that happen to chart on the Billboard Top 40, Rhythm of Love and Love Will Find a Way. The hooks on the former are excellent, and John Anderson's Beach Boys impressions are a fantastic touch. And the latter, even if really of its time, and having that really dated 80s guitar that I don't like all over it, is fun in the way it kind of jumps around and stays catchy the whole time, and that weird string quartet intro is the kind of unnecessary addition that just throws it into great territory for me. I was kind of hoping to defend this album because I love those 2 songs, but the rest of this thing, There's like flashes of cool ideas all over the place, a couple of attempts at combining all this flashy late 80s sound with a little more free-flowing prog structure, but for the most part it is way oversold, overbearing, and often pretty corny. The album as a whole is a pretty big train wreck with a lot of tracks I like parts of but not the whole thing. The closest it comes to the 2 big singles quality-wise is maybe I'm Running, which has more of a fast-paced vibe and more change-ups and evolution. It's doing its best to justify its length. And there's xylophones. I like xylophones. But then there's some weird guitar licks that remind me of the song Tequila by the Champs that just take me out of it. And Final Eyes is decent. It has parts that sound like Your Move and has some fun with its meandering and lack of hooks, but it is also entirely forgettable. Almost Like Love has another weak hook propped up by a neat horn section that makes them sound like Huey Lewis and the News. It's okay, I guess. But the closer, Holy Lamb, is almost non-existent. The vocals on Shoot High, Aim Low are memorable for all the wrong reasons. What are they even going for with that delivery? Trying to make it sound like John Anderson's being strangled? Shoot! Ah! But the title track is one of the worst tracks that Yes have ever made. I don't know how they managed to make every guitar on this track sound like complete ass, but they did. The track feels big for bigness' sake, with the most empty and stupid sounding hook. Big generator, moving to the left, moving to the right. It is so obnoxious. I do not understand the appeal. I can just picture the cocaine flying in the air during this recording section. As all over the place as this album gets, though, I'll still keep it over Tornado. The lowest points are lower for me, but it feels like they were actually trying on this album. Misguided sometimes, and it is suffocating in its 80s production, but they managed to recapture a little bit of the success they found on 90125. They gave me 2 solid 80s pop rock tunes that I still quite enjoy, and it undoubtedly has a leg over the 90s albums like Talk and Open Your Eyes, because as bad as this album gets, I remember it. The experience of listening to this album in all its moments, good and bad, is one that's at least really stuck with me. If you have more of a stomach for this kind of super loud and overblown and overproduced 80s rock, I think there's certainly some fun to be had here, but otherwise, it's nothing you need to go out of your way for. Whoopsh. At number 14, I have The Ladder. I remember picking up a copy of The Ladder from the library near our house and listening to it for the first time, having only heard the 3 big classic 70s albums, 90125 and Big Generator. And The Ladder was the newest album of theirs that they had a CD of there, and I listened to it and I was like, man, what a boring letdown. Though I did manage to get it to marginally grow on me. There were a couple of moments that I liked even back then, and while not nearly as memorable an album as Big Generator, is definitely easier to get through and more listenable. That album is a giant mixed bag. This one is decent. It's decent, it's consistent, it's got its moments. By the standards of 90s, yes, it's a major accomplishment and a return to form. Unquestionably the best of the entirely studio recordings they put out in that decade. Given what I feel about the other entirely studio 90s albums, it's not saying much. But yes, The Ladder is at least decent. There's no truly great moments on The Ladder, but there's no outright bad ones either. It has little to none of the creativity or originality that the 70s stuff does, but it doesn't feel nearly as phoned in as the other 90s stuff, or Tornado either. They sound like they at least kinda had fun making this one. It's an above average listen with several good songs. And pretty much the whole thing is a grower with repeat listens. It's almost never because of the instrumental textures, though. They are super plain instrumentally and rather formulaic. But they do bring varying levels of energy to keep it from getting too boring, like they can go really fast-paced and energetic on tracks like Lightning Strikes and Face to Face, but also have a couple of decent ballads, like If Only You Knew. A lot of these tracks have good melodies and hooks to back themselves up, like Homeworld and To Be Alive, and Finally. There's a couple of neat callbacks to old albums like Can I, sounding like a weird, more exotic-flavored alternate version of We Have Heaven from Fragile, and the closer, Nine Voices Long Walker, which has a couple of little references to Your Move. But the album's main crime is just not being very interesting. Can I was the only moment on here that was instrumentally interesting enough to stick with me in the long term. I mean, this thing doesn't put me in a bad mood like Talkin' Union do. It doesn't feel half-assed. There are a couple of tracks that I still remember the tune to. John Anderson sounds like he is putting the right emotion into these songs and selling them pretty well, but I can't sit here and say that I think this album brings enough to the table that you couldn't already get elsewhere. The album just kind of feels like it's just there and that's it. I'm not opposed to coming back to it. It's certainly pleasant while it's on, but they have a lot better and more interesting stuff that you could revisit instead. It's nice, but not a must-listen. Whoopsh. At number 13, I have Keys to Ascension 2. The Keys to Ascension albums are a weird beast to tackle for this ranking, since only half of each is new studio material. Or in the case of the first one, less than half. Though this was simple enough to ignore in the case of Keys to Ascension 2, just isolate the studio disc of the album and treat it as if it were an album in its own right, though also happening to contain a solid live concert. Lots of fun, but you can technically ignore the first disc if you want, since these versions don't add a lot that you couldn't already get out of the originals. Like, I really like this version of Time in a Word, that's probably the biggest highlight, but what about the studio disc? Well, it starts out with an 18-minute track called Mind Drive that has all the instrumental flair and excitement and passion and weirdness that was totally missing on all their other 90s work. So right off the bat, that's a pretty great sign. The other tracks on here, like Footprints and Bring Me to the Power, may not have as much hook power as the stuff they put out in their prime, but it's certainly as punchy and instrumentally interesting as I'd hoped for out of them. Blows most of their other 90s stuff out of the water, quite frankly. Children of Light is another solid two-parter with a pretty awesome outro. Apparently the first half was co-written by Vangelis, too, so that's cool, I guess. Wouldn't have been able to guess he was involved. And it ends in a nice little instrumental called Sign Language that does have quite a low-key and emotive feel to it. All really good stuff. As a whole, live and studio stuff together, the studio stuff is more worth your time if you ask me. The live stuff was a good palate cleanser for when I was marathoning their stuff in chronological order, but it's nothing you need to go out of your way for. And I will admit that even if you take the studio half of this album out of context, it's still not quite up to par with the 70s stuff. Just not catchy enough to work in that way for me. But it is definitely at least good sounding and well produced enough to keep me invested the whole time. It meanders around in a way that feels interesting and never boring. We have finally made it into the part of this ranking where I feel like I can say for certain this is the good stuff. Moving on from there, whoopsh. At number 12, I have Keys to Ascension. It was really hard to figure out where to put this one in the ranking, especially because it only has 2 original tracks, while certainly long and well-fleshed out ones also add up to about 3/4 of an album. If I had to take those 2 out of context and count those as an album, it'd be an okay enough album that's way too short in my eyes. The first of the 2 studio tracks, Be the One, is a 10-minute 3-part suite, but the parts blend together to the point where it's hard to tell them apart, and the whole thing stinks of the same instrumental blandness that plagues so much of 90s yes. Probably would have blended right into the latter, though. But the other studio track, the 19-minute 7-part suite entitled That Is excellent. The 7 parts are all distinct, but work together in a compelling way. The track also focuses more on the kinds of sound play and styles explored in their 70s work. While not as catchy or evocative as some of the Close to the Edge era stuff, it certainly has the bigness of something like Awaken or The Gates of Delirium, and it's just a lot of fun to listen to from start to finish. Fantastic stuff and absolutely worth picking up just for that. Now the 2 studio tracks obviously aren't much of an album by themselves, which makes it harder to ignore the live concert in the ranking. Also not helped by the fact that the concert is really freaking good. It has a whole bunch of my favorites like Siberian Katru and The Revealing Science of God, and that Starship Trooper performance went ridiculously hard. Excellent stuff. Not every moment is super exciting. They play Onward from Tornado, it's fine enough. And their cover of Paul Simon's America is cool, I guess. but there's so much good stuff in this album to definitely merit a listen. If I ignore the live material, then Keys to Ascension 2 would get ranked higher purely for having more substance, but this is ranked based on my personal enjoyment, and I was more engaged by the experience of listening to the first volume than the second. I don't feel as comfortable ranking this even higher, given how reliant it is on their older material that I already have a stronger connection to. Feels kinda like cheating. But it did have one showstopper of a finish that can't be overlooked either. If the studio material on the two Keys to Ascension albums were just combined into one album without any of the live material, it'd be the best 90s Yes album by a huge margin. And that album actually does exist. It's a compilation called Key Studio that does just what I described. Though, given it was released several years after the fact and isn't available on streaming services, I can't count it. But whatever, I guess overall, I enjoy the first Keys to Ascension a lot, and I can give it my thumbs up in general. It is a very fun listening experience, and the studio material from the two albums put together would have made for a really solid return to form for these guys. Whoopsh. At number 11, I have Drama. This album in some ways feels like it's coming out of a Yes tribute band. Rick Wakeman and John Anderson being replaced with Trevor Horn and Jeff Downs of the Buggles is a very weird move. And the former is an especially noticeable change. I mean, Horn pulls off a convincing enough John Anderson impression on the closer Tempest Fugit and most of the opener Machine Messiah, before that impression slowly wears off as he struggles with those high notes and is really obviously straining to hit them. The whole album feels like it's trying to be something Yes would do if it had their normal lineup, emulated by people who weren't as used to doing stuff in that particular mold. But like, even if it can get a little Uncanny Valley-ish in that way, it's still surprisingly credible and solid. So if it's a little off, it's still good. There are meh tracks here too. White Car is a moment that just feels out of place and has any Yes fans instantly be like, oh, that really is not John Anderson. But it's just a minute and a half, and it still sounds good with all its very nice synth layering. Does It Really Happen and Run Through the Light aren't the most memorable of tunes. But they're both perfectly competent, have all the musicianship you'd want out of a Yes project. And the former has some cool xylophone-y tones and some Siberian Katru-like moments. Machine Messiah could have fooled me into thinking nothing had changed with this band in the first place, aside from having more modernized and super crisp 80s production. Just a few iffy vocal moments from Horn near the end, and they're forgivable since, I mean, John Anderson has an insane vocal range that is near impossible to replicate. He's close enough. Tempest Fugit as a closer is excellent, really hard-hitting and fast-paced, and again, could have fooled me into thinking Trevor Horn is the real deal. Oh, and it has vocoders from Jeff Downs too, nice touch. But strangely enough, easily my favorite moment on this album is when Trevor Horn isn't trying to be John Anderson at all and just fleshes out a Buggles demo into a long-form Yes epic that is Into the Lens. This track, not enough people talk about Into the Lens, presumably because it's not all that Yes-ish. Sure, it has all the great prog-rock flares and switching sections, but the tune underneath it all isn't quite as abstract or huge in scale as Yes songs usually were. But Into the Lens is not just the catchiest and most emotive in the bunch, but it's also the most natural sounding. Since Horn wrote it for his own vocal range, he doesn't strain himself, he sounds great. And the instrumental is great too, as fantastically herky-jerky as it is, and yeah, I don't care, I just love this track. It made Trevor Horn feel like a credible member of the band for me. He brought his own personality to that track and a flair to it that no one else could have brought, but he still absolutely made it feel like Yes at the same time. That track is fantastic and I will hear no word to the contrary. And as a whole, Drama can get a little spotty, but it's an altogether pretty unique point in the Yes catalog that holds up as pretty solid and shouldn't scare you away just because it has a different singer. Whoopsh. At number 10, I have Relayer. Relayer. This is probably their most experimental and least poppy album. The 3 tracks here are rather freeform and lacking in hooks. It has some of their noisiest moments too. Obviously the reason to check out this album is the side-long 21-minute opener, The Gates of Delirium, which is about literal war and separates itself into 3 relatively distinct sections. One that sounds like the peaceful sounds of their previous album, Tales from Topographic Oceans. We'll get to that one. But the lyrics are instead kind of building up this big battle. Then there's a long instrumental section that represents the battle itself, and it's really loud and chaotic. And then finally at the end there's a soft ballad called Soon, which represents the aftermath and a need for hope at the end, I guess. It's a ton of fun. The other side I'm not as huge on, but it still has its moments. Sound Chaser is quite possibly the craziest 9 minutes they've put to record. Loads of solos and cool jazz fusion improvisation, and Anderson's weird da 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 thing at the end that always put me off, but whatever. So we got one great 18-minute epic and another pretty solid 9-minute experimental piece, so why is this album only at number 10? This is entirely because the closer, To Be Over. Now, this isn't the kind of track that feels out of place or has some bad idea behind it. I don't even hate it on principle or anything, or think it's bad out of context. It starts out promising, this peaceful soundscape piece with a bit of orchestral fluff and even cool sitars for that little touch of psychedelic flavor. But this track just goes nowhere. It's not samey or repetitive either. I wish it were more repetitive so I could remember it better. It's just so long and meandering and drawn out and boring. It's the shortest track of the three, but it's by far the one that drags the most. Nothing really grabs my attention, and it mostly just has me waiting for something more exciting to happen and never delivers. And I mean, it sounds fine, but it's not wowing me with subtlety and sound design in the same way as the I Get Up, I Get Down section of Close to the Edge, or a later piece like Turn of the Century. To Be Over is basically just pretty musical wallpaper that has me waiting for it to finish and taking its sweet time, wearing my patience thin, and by the end of the track I'm completely checked out and I'm left unsatisfied and underwhelmed. It took such a long time to notice how much dead weight it was because of the way its aimlessness matches the freeform structure of the previous tracks and its similar aesthetics that let it blend into the album, often instead had me questioning whether I even enjoyed the other two tracks as much. Yeah, I know this sounds harsh. To Be Over isn't terrible by itself, just okay. But what it does for Relay, pacing-wise, makes it one of my least favorite endings of any Yes album. But the rest of this thing is absolutely worth recommending. You can just take the first track out of context. It's practically a mini-album with a full arc and satisfying finish by itself. And Sound Chaser, while I don't love, I still very much appreciate the existence of, and it's great to see Yes explore their weirder side. And the last track you can just take or leave. Relayer's pretty solid and forward-thinking and interesting. I just wish I could get into it more than I already do. Whoopsh. At number 9, I have Magnification. So it's 2001. Yes just lost another keyboardist. They go back to Rick Wakeman to see if he'll join them for their next album. He says fuck off. So what do they do without a keyboardist? How about getting an entire freaking live orchestra? Hell yeah! The inclusion of the orchestra in this album got it up this high on the ranking all by itself. The songs may not always be the most memorable they've ever made, but even in this album's worst moments, the orchestra pulls so much weight and makes tracks that might otherwise be kinda bland and forgettable feel really monumental and important and cosmic sounding. It's implemented ridiculously well. Just listen to tracks like the punchy and action-packed Spirit of Survival, the beautifully expansive Give Love Each Day, the folk tinge and intimate Soft as a Dove, the shifting complexity of We Agree that goes from low-key to internally tumultuous to big and dramatic, and others. They get so many fantastic sounding songs out of that orchestra. I don't know why they didn't try going symphonic more often. Maybe out of embarrassment from Time to Word? They shouldn't be embarrassed by that. I'll get to that one. When the song itself is already as monumental to match the orchestras, that's when this album really shines. The two 10-minute tracks, the supremely epic and chaotic Dreamtime, and the grand and awe-inspiring 4-part suite In the Presence Of, are just as awesome and magical as you'd think they'd be when you look over the track listing. And of course, there's the title track. My god, the title track. I love the title track. Magnification! I'll be honest, the only reason this album isn't ranked higher is because I rarely make it past the title track, which is such an incredible track and one of my favorite Yes tracks ever. One track on here that would have been fantastic even without the orchestra since it has so many catchy hooks to back it up, but that orchestra just takes it to another level that I can't even really put into words. None of the other tracks on here hit that transcendent level that first one does. Peaks too early. But anytime I actually do sit through the whole thing, I'm always glad I did and wonder why I don't more often. Because the rest of this album is still great. This is a super underrated entry in the Yes catalog, one that is completely unlike any other album they've ever done, and should not be missed either. well, maybe not a great starting point. It's probably better you go into their earlier stuff first and then come back here for that novelty of how awesome Yes are with a full live orchestra. But definitely don't skip this one. It's pretty excellent. At number 8, I have Fly From Here.
Looking out from this position.
This album is probably higher than most people have it, but I don't care. It's always been a personal favorite. My age probably plays into this especially, because when this came out in 2011, I was just starting high school and hadn't been a Yes fan for very long yet. But at that point, the classic stuff was very much in heavy rotation and I was a big fan, and I had already heard The Ladder and Big Generator and knew that not everything this band made was solid gold. The 6-part suite of the title track had me excited enough that this could be something special, so I actually paid attention to the release and picked it up as soon as it came out, and that title track suite was everything I hoped it would be and then some. And thanks to that extra high school nostalgia factor, the suite is almost certainly in my top 10 favorite tracks from Yes ever. It's like Into the Lens on steroids. Also based on demos Trevor Horn and Jeff Downes made for the Buggles back in the day, but fleshed out to the most epic extent possible. Part 1 and 2 are quite emotive and catchy, but the rollicking energy of parts 3 and 4 are my favorites, especially part 3, Madman at the Screams. I love the whole thing so much, even to this day. It was the last truly transcendental moment for me in Yes. And while I'm at it, the whole album is basically a bigger and better follow-up to Drama for me. Horn and Downes are all over them, and most of the album's best moments come from them. Not to mention Horn doesn't handle the vocals himself either, it's instead covered by Benoit David, or however you say his name, sorry. Some people have complained about him, but when the album came out I didn't even notice it wasn't John Anderson. It doesn't hit as many high notes, but it would have been reasonable for Anderson to have lessened his range somewhat at his age. I had to look it up to find out he'd jumped ship again. Yeah, the singer here is pretty great. Now, even this album's biggest detractors agree that the title suite is the best part, and that it's the much less memorable second half that takes this thing down. And I will admit this album's second half doesn't get nearly as much replay value out of me as the title suite, but even this stuff is pretty solid. The only clunker for me is Hour of Need, kind of a plain ballad that doesn't stick out, but it's not unlistenable or negatively impacts the album in a significant enough way. The Man You Always Wanted Me to Be as vocals handled by Chris Squire, and that was way more noticeable a change than Benoit David or even Trevor Horn. But Squire handled backing vocals for years, and he does fine here too. The rest is good. Life on a Film Set and Into the Storm have a lot of fun energy to them, and Solitaire has a nice little solo guitar piece from How. None of this stuff is bad at all. The album's first half is just way better. But overall, as front-loaded as this album is, I still come back to it a lot and consider it a major personal highlight in their catalog. I think it's excellent, especially considering how late in their career it came out. Really wish they'd ended the Yes story with this album and went out on a high note. But whatever, now it's time to get to the real big top tier stuff. Whoosh. At number 7, I have Fragile. This is probably a lower than it might be otherwise, thanks to some burnout from overhype and overplay, kind of the way everyone is with Dark Side of the Moon. But I also believe that Fragile is probably the best introduction to the band and the best jumping on point if you've never heard any album of theirs. Just to let you know their capabilities, each member getting their own little track to showcase their individual talents, and a couple of big centerpieces where they come together as a group. Now, it can be a little all over the place for me on a personal level. Heart of the Sunrise has parts I really like, but other parts that don't grab me as much. Never been a giant favorite personally, even if it is a classic track. Long Distance Runaround is totally useless to me if you don't have the fish right after it. Not so much vice versa, but they are better as one piece, and I do still find myself in the mood to put those on every now and then. And the other interludes like Hams and Brahms or 5% for Nothing or Mood for a Day, I tend not to be in the mood for and almost never listen to out of context. Even We Have Heaven, which I think is gorgeous and my easy favorite of them, I still almost never actually listen to by itself these days. They're all good showcases for individual members' talent, but don't offer much replay value. But on the other hand, this album has, like, my 2 absolute favorite Yes songs ever, which keep me coming back to this album repeatedly by themselves. There's obviously Roundabout, one of their most fun and energetic tracks ever, and the easiest go-to example of why they're great, even divorced from the JoJo memes. And there's South Side of the Sky, which I might actually prefer a tiny bit more. I can seemingly never get sick of that one no matter how much I listen to it, being simultaneously much heavier than Roundabout in its main sections, and being almost literally about death. But that absolutely gorgeous middle section is what throws it over the top and gives it that stronger emotional connection for me. I think it's a close call between that track and Siberian Katru as my favorite song from them ever. Now, absolutely, I put this album on all the time, and I still consider it good enough to be this high on the ranking. It's an undisputed classic, but I had to be honest with myself and say that 90% of the time when I put this album on, I'm not in the mood to listen to Fragile the album. I'm in the mood to hear one specific track on Fragile. I usually listen to just Roundabout, or just South Side of the Sky, or just Long Distance Run Around in the Fish. But the whole thing in one go? I mean, sometimes. It's not like the other tracks are bad or intrusive in any way. Most of the others are really short. But as much as I do still enjoy it and come back to it all the time, I don't think it's very consistent, and I skip tracks all the time. So this is as high as I can put it in the ranking. Still absolutely worth checking out, it is an indisputable classic, but alright, if I didn't get lots of fans mad with not having this album in the top 3, I imagine it'll be nothing compared to this next ranking. Whoopee. At number 6, I have 90125. Oh boy, I am going to really enjoy the salt in the comment section over this one. Yes, the ever infamous 90125. So, to explain the inevitable vitriol coming from me here, this album is basically Yes's sellout move. It's a hard turn for the commercial, and abandoning a lot of their progressive rock roots in favor of a far more mainstream accessible 80s pop rock sound, with really modernized production that sounds pretty of its time. The kind of move that always goes over really well with fans, right? On top of that, it was super commercially successful, notched them their highest charting hit ever with Owner of a Lonely Heart, which incentivized them to continue down this pathway of making more mainstream-friendly material and do stuff like Big Generator and then slide down in the 90s, and I've already gone on enough about how great that era was for them. I fully understand the people who hate this album with a passion, but I will continue to say what I've always said when it comes to albums like these. Just because it's a sellout doesn't mean it's bad. A turn for the commercial can reveal different strengths to a band that they might not have focused on previously, and I think these guys always had an album like this in them, because as complex and meandering as older albums of theirs could get, their most celebrated ones always still had a sense of accessibility to them. They had the ability to get these massively long songs stuck in your head because they were great at putting together hooks. So an album that just focuses on their hook writing ability with no intricate complexities? I'm on board for it. It's something different while still playing to their strengths. I can see this kind of 80s pop rock not being everyone's cup of tea. It's usually not even mine. Like, I'm not much of a Van Halen or a Def Leppard guy, for instance. But I still like every song on here. John Anderson's voice just has that little element of unmistakable eccentricity to help me into the sound, and the production, especially on Owner of a Lonely Heart, has this chopped-up manic weirdness to it, courtesy of Trevor Horn, again, bringing over some influence from his producer band, The Art of Noise. By the way, you need to check out the first Art of Noise album. It shows this kind of punchy 80s sounding production in a much more experimental context, and it's so delightfully strange, and it has Moments of Love, which is one of the best songs ever. But I digress. The rest of 90125 is solid too. Most of these tracks I like just for their big sing-along hooks that get stuck in the head super easily, like Hold On and City of Love. Love Hold On, especially. That one's underrated. But they keep some of their old weirdness too, like the sitars on It Can Happen, the weird vocal layering on Leave It, but especially on Changes, which has that amazing intro with all the xylophones. I mean, it's not like they've completely abandoned their prog roots. Changes is also super underrated. There's even a pretty epic little instrumental in there with Cinema, that's a nice touch. But, okay, as for what edged this over Fragile, I will admit it's extremely close, so don't feel too bad about it. But that album has most of its quality stuffed into two 10 out of 10 moments. This album doesn't have any moments even close to as amazing as Roundabout or South Side of the Sky, but it's far more consistent. I am much less likely to skip tracks on this one and more enjoy just putting it on and hearing it all in one go. There's no duds here in my eyes. And on top of that, my not having been there when it came out is also probably very much to this album's benefit. First of all, when my dad recommended Yes to me, my first exposure wasn't listening to any specific album, but just buying their 2 most popular tracks, Owner of a Lonely Heart and Roundabout, at the same time on iTunes. Point is, I couldn't be betrayed by this album's sea change when it was already part of my initial exposure to who they were. I just enjoyed the album for what it was. Sure, I did gravitate a bit more towards the longer and more complex stuff, but 90125 was always a rock-solid project to me, and I think it's just as worth a shot as any classic period Yes album. Now, of course, this isn't me saying that Yes is better as a pop band than a prog band, but I think my favorite albums of theirs tend to be the ones where they're still super proggy and long-winded and over-complex, but can combine it with their more accessible and hook-friendly side, as seen on, for instance, whoopsh. At number 5, I have Going for the One. Going for the One is a hell of an underrated project in my eyes. Not to say I don't have my problems with it as well. I'll admit a big sticking point for me is that this album has one clunker for me with the third track, Parallels. An otherwise pretty fun rock tune, almost ruined by the presence of these really out-of-place church organs all over the place. I'll be honest, I've never liked the sound of church organs, and you'd be fighting an uphill battle for my enjoyment just by including them in any context. Sometimes I can at least get into it if I'm in a certain mood, like it's not quite as bad on Close to the Edge, or even the other track that prominently features it on this album, Awaken, is fine there too, but on Parallels, it doesn't really work. Like, the stodgy and ultra-serious tone of those organs cancels out the much less serious-sounding tune behind it, creating this weird tonal clash that really rubs me the wrong way. It's like they think church organs are fun or something, and yeah, no, stop. If this track used just plain old Hammond organs like they used on the Yes album, it would be so much better off if you ask me. As is, it's and I tend to skip it, but if you make that replacement, this album would be about as on par with Close to the Edge for me, because the rest of this album is amazing. Like I said, the church organs are on Awaken as well, but it doesn't bother me nearly as much as on Parallels, because here they fit a lot better with that kind of grand, epic, glorious, orchestral sounding vibe they're going for, and are less intrusive to begin with. And there's just so much other instrumentation and interesting detours on top of that, 15 minutes utilized very well. It really feels like this is a gigantic, celebratory soundtrack to the birth of the universe. That is how you freaking close out a Yes album. And the other 3 tracks are maybe even bigger favorites. The title track is probably the biggest winner for me, while much more straightforward than the usual from them at this point, kinda blues rockish maybe, not containing any multiple parts or sidetracks. The tune itself is just so addicting and has an energy to it that gets me hyped up every time. And Turn of the Century and Wondrous Stories are beautiful, echo-heavy soundscapes that also happen to have solid and catchy tunes behind them as backbones. Well, the latter is much catchier, it's like Your Move on steroids, but the former has much more impressive and layered sound design, better at getting that emotional reaction out of me. Oh yeah, and this whole album sounds fantastic on top of that. While the biggest heights on Fragile are definitely higher than those on here, I give the edge to this one because I enjoy it more consistently just percentage-wise, and while 90125 is also more consistent for me than this, I think the high points here are higher than those on there too. Sure, there's stuff I'd like to change here, but even what we got is a pretty dang amazing album that's absolutely worth a shot. Whoosh. At number 4, I have Time and a Word. So, might be a bit of a strange decision to have this album up this high in the ranking. I'm certainly not expecting a lot of people to agree with me on this, but I don't care. It's my ranking, and I feel like we need someone on the internet to gush over Time and a Word. I love this album from start to finish, and put it on just as frequently as the classics, no joke. And I know that may come as a surprise, especially since I didn't think their debut was anything special. And I will admit it suffers from very similar problems. Like, the production is still rough and shoddy, and despite adding a full-on orchestra into the mix, they did not succeed in making the band not sound like amateurs. Like, I completely understand if people think this thing sounds like crap, because, I mean, they would not be wrong. But that orchestra made a really big difference for me. Sure, they still sound like nobodies, but they're ambitious nobodies, damn it. That shoddily dubbed orchestra adds an element of over-the-top try-hardness, like they still don't have the finesse to do what they want with this stuff, and seem way in over their heads with a total lack of self-awareness, but you really have to admire how grand their visions are and their commitment to fulfilling them. And unlike the debut, everyone sounds like they're having a lot of fun, and it ends up having this kind of campy B-movie type appeal for me. But that alone wouldn't raise this album as high for me, especially when you've got Magnification right there, which utilizes the orchestras a lot more seamlessly. But the tunes on this one are way stronger and catchier. They still meander and they're not as sharp as the stuff they do later, but I remember the tune to pretty much all the songs here, and they all have that unmistakable yes charm. The cover of Richie Haven's No Opportunity Necessary, No Experience Needed at the beginning is just the most over-the-top and ridiculous thing ever, and it is absolutely glorious and instantly puts me in a good mood. Probably also helps that I didn't grow up with the original like I did for Every Little Thing, and so this is basically just another Yes song to me with extra flair and campiness. And just so happens to be one of my most listened to Yes songs ever. And there's really no stinkers on here either. Well, okay, Clear Days isn't great. You can really tell the orchestras were playing at a different time and place from John Anderson, and the track just abruptly fades out after 2 minutes. But it's still not that bad at all. It's kind of cute even. And The Prophet and Astral Traveler are kind of meandery as well and don't stick in the head, though those two are still a lot of fun to listen to with all their experimentalism. But the title track is a really nice heartfelt finish with a memorable hook. Then is another glorious mess that never fails to get me hyped up with all its horns blaring. And just the way it totally fires on all cylinders the whole time. Every Days has both mysterious low-key moments and pumped-up moments and keeps me interested the whole time. And Sweet Dreams is one of the catchiest tracks they've ever made that nobody seems to acknowledge for some reason. Overall, I can understand that this album is not for everyone, doesn't quite deliver on the core appeal of what Yes typically deliver, and is probably best enjoyed if you don't take it too seriously. But the fact that I don't have to take it quite so seriously is a big part of what I like so much about it. Again, I seriously doubt people will have this album up this high in the ranking, and I will perfectly understand that. But it's one that I come back to so often that I just had to put it up all the way up near the top. Maybe this one ought to be re-examined in the Yes Pantheon. In my eyes, it is quite possibly their single most underrated project, and I will defend it to the ends of the earth. Whoopsh. And number 3, we actually have Close to the Edge. Alright, well, it's the most hyped up Yes album ever, the one that everyone says is their masterpiece. And yeah, I'd probably have to agree. It'd probably be the easiest and most obvious number 1 pick, and that in itself may be why I decided not to make it my number 1 pick. I mean, it certainly has the potential to, if I'm in the right mood, and I actually expected it to be when I first started to work on this video. But I don't like jumping on bandwagon hype if I don't have to. Because sometimes it's better to go into an album not expecting to get the greatest example of a given genre ever created by mankind. I don't adore every single second of Close to the Edge like most people seem to. Well, sometimes I do. That's why it's still up this high. The fact that songs these long and complex are as easily memorable and catchy as they are is its biggest accomplishment and the reason it's so easy for me to return to over and over. At this point in the ranking, it just came down to tiny nitpicks and differences in preference. Like, for me, the title track is excellent, though doesn't reach the transcendental level for me that other tracks of theirs can. Most of this track is pretty awesome, the first 2 sections having so much manic energy and beauty, stuffing hook after hook next to each other, and being unrelentingly fun to listen to. Then breaks into the 3rd section, I Get Up, I Get Down, which is really frustrating because it's both the best and the worst part of this track for me. The first half of the section creates this absolutely gorgeous ambient subspace with layers of vocal harmonies, and just this super haunting feeling that I have like no words for. And then this giant Bach-inspired organ solo slams through everything, and that part can lose me sometimes. I already mentioned I'm not a fan of the sound of that particular sound at church organ. It's not out of place here like on Parallels, but it doesn't slowly ease you in over the course of a few minutes either, like Awaken does. It just goes from really subtle and haunting to over the top in 3 seconds. Though it also really works as this big epic climactic moment too, so I can't get mad at it either. And look, I know I'm being super nitpicky here, but it's literally tiny nitpicks like these that decided this spot in the ranking. Now the second side is in fact much more consistently enjoyable for me, and You and I switches between cute and heartfelt one moment to epic and apocalyptic the next, and it all gets it to work together somehow, even if I think it peaks at its first section. But the one track that I consistently get into no matter my current mood at that time, and easily my favorite part of the album, is the final track, Siberian Khatru. I don't see how anyone can dislike Siberian Khatru. The way it just ricochets all over the place, being so energetic and catchy one moment and feels like it's gliding through the air the next. Being really fast-paced like Yours Is No Disgrace on steroids, never a dull moment throughout its 9 minutes of running time. I say steroids a lot in this video. That may very well be my single favorite Yes track overall, as mentioned previously. So yeah, this album is a classic, another one of the easiest starting points for this band if you've never heard anything of theirs before. I pretty much agree with the hype that it's amassed, and certainly would have been my number one pick if you asked me before I actually started work on this video. Right now though, there's 2 other Yes albums that I personally enjoy a little more. Whoosh. At number 2, I have Tales from Topographic Oceans. Yep, this one seems to get a lot of mixed opinions. Certainly wasn't very well received at the time, and people seem to think it was this unwieldy, overlong mess that was so up its own ass that the keyboardist at the time, Rick Wakeman, just decided, fuck this, and quit the band after this album. I think there's been kind of a critical re-examining of this one as of late, though. People are starting to turn around on it. Me personally, I never really understood the hate even on first listen. I suppose it depends on your tolerance for long and meandering tracks like these. I mean, this album is 4 tracks adding up to 81 minutes total, the shortest of which is 18.5 minutes and still longer than the title track of Close to the Edge. And it's a concept album centered around John Anderson's interpretation of 4 Hindu texts. I suppose it can be a bit much. I think, though, this is one place where my background in electronic music and having been so long obsessed with bands like Orbital and others really worked in my favor, because I never found this album's length to be a problem. I mean, 80 minutes, some of my own albums are longer than that. You don't scare me. I feel like the people who hate on this album for its length are the same kind of people who were weirded out by Radiohead's Kid A because it has all this weird electronic stuff. Ugh. Lightweights. I do feel like this is the kind of album that you need to go in knowing what you're actually going to get, though. Like, if you're looking for tracks that jump through iconic riffs and catchy hooks, you will be disappointed. Even as someone who loves the album, there's no track like Siberian Khatru where it's got a really abstract structure, but I remember every musical passage like the back of my hand. Revealing Signs of God comes really close, but even that's not written on the same level of familiarity, and I couldn't hum any of the melodies from the other tracks. But I see this album kind of more like the rock music equivalent to something like BET's This Binary Universe, where its sheer density and lack of a defined structure is its main asset. This is an album that aims to sound just as massive and sprawling as its song lengths would have you believe, and the whole thing basically sets up this expansive musical world for you to explore. Also, the sounds themselves are relatively agreeable and tend towards the mellower side of their sound, so it's not like some challenging, super experimental record in that way. There are some moments of The Ancient which are pretty out there, but they're still definitely musical enough to not distract from the experience. If anything, they're some of my favorite moments because of how they stick out in the sound of the rest of the album and add plenty of new interesting flavor. Everything else tends to have this kind of grand symphonic swell to it, using those mellotrons in exactly the way they were meant to be used, while still having plenty of time for more energetic close to the edge style moments. Sure, you could say that this album is pretentious and self-indulgent, and you wouldn't be wrong, but it's still not in the sense of you feeling one dude's inflated ego. This is just the kind of album you get lost in. It exudes the beauty of the natural world we live in. The band even perfectly harmonizes with each other. If you hadn't told me that the keyboardist was just absolutely hating the experience of making the album and heavily drinking, I'd never be able to guess, since he's just as important a part of the music and as everyone else, and he seamlessly works off the other members. Do not let the negative reviews scare you away from this one. There's an experience to be gleaned from this album that is completely unlike anything else out there, not just in the Yes catalog, but anywhere, period. And one that's absolutely worth the time immersing yourself in. It's an absolutely massive achievement. Not quite my favorite from them, though. That honor goes to... Whoopsh. And number 1, I have the Yes album. I don't really know what to say. For the top of this list, I just kind of went with what I know best. The Yes album isn't exactly an album that takes me on a journey like other albums of theirs. It's not campy and ridiculous like Time in a Word. It's not as insanely expansive as Tales from Topographic Oceans. It's not as much of an iconic hallmark of music like Close to the Edge. It's one of their most normal albums. But I like it in that way. It's comfortable, it's like home. I've heard it gazillions of times since high school. It pops up in the shuffle playlist my dad has on his iPod that we play during family dinner. It's one of those albums that just kind of feels like it's a part of me and rides high on that nostalgia factor. I don't really have many complicated thoughts on it. It's the album where they really nailed down their style, making tracks that were super long and perpetually changed from section to section, but never at any point losing any sense of accessibility or actually feeling even close to as long as they actually were. This thing just zips by for me super quick. I wasn't actually expecting to have this at my number 1 spot when I started work on this video, especially since I think the ending track Perpetual Change isn't one of my biggest favorites, but that's still a great track too. And yeah, just in terms of which album of theirs gives me the most joy listening to it, just pure personal enjoyment, I gotta go with the Yes album. It's practically flawless from start to finish. Yours Is No Disgrace, Starship Troopers, I've Seen All Good People, all classic tracks that I've practically memorized at this point. I don't see how one can just hear that first payoff of the former do 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 do, or the entire second half of the latter and just not instantly be put in a good mood. The Clap is probably my all-time favorite track that only uses the acoustic guitar and nothing else. Adventure is really underrated too, and I adore that slow build-up with the pianos and the tune that comes after it. And like I said, Perpetual Change is great and lives up to its title with all its chaotic change-ups. And yeah, that's basically it. Just absolutely love every moment on here, and it's the one album of theirs that makes me the happiest while listening to it. Oh yeah, it's the only Yes album I have a CD of right now, so that's cool. I really need to get more. But yeah, I am going to leave it at that. Of course, all of this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me a review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. And I only get electronic requests, though. We'll return to regularly scheduled electronic reviews after this. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.